Right now, I am in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and in a prior episode of History Traveler, we were right here at a place called Warfield Ridge, which is where something called Barksdale's Charge kicked off. Now, in that episode, we talked about the fighting that took place around the Sherfy farm and around the peach orchard. But what about the people who lived here? What was at stake for them, and what did they come back to? Well, that's one of the things that we are going to be looking at today in this farmhouse right over here. So again, if you've watched any of the previous episodes of History Traveler from here at Gettysburg, well, then this place and this story are familiar. So off to our left again, so here we're along Longstreet's first corps line. Right over here is the Mississippi Monument, so over there is where Barksdale's brigade would have been staged up on the afternoon of July 2nd. And in that episode where we were talking about the fight that took place here, well, we showed that over here from the Confederate perspective, they're looking out across these fields at Sherfy's peach orchard, and then off to the left a little bit, on the other side of those trees, well, you can see the Sherfy barn and the Sherfy home. This is where Dan Sickles' 3rd Corps would have come out to and really just kind of messed up Longstreet's plan. Now, right here where I am standing, this is where E. Porter Alexander's artillery battalion would have been staged up. And there was a gunfight that took place between the Confederates and the artillery of the Union that really made this an unpleasant place. So these guys are going to be firing canister at one another. And right in the middle, caught in the crossfire, is James Warfield. But Warfield wouldn't be here. As a matter of fact, like many people in this area, he had left for multiple reasons.
The borough of Gettysburg was a thriving little community come the summer of 1863. Had about 2,400 people residing here, and generation by generation the community was growing. There were many farmers, there were many people seeking higher educations here, and there were also blacksmiths and other trade professions that were likewise associated with this lush agrarian lifestyle that we see here. Among those individuals who was looking to start a new life for himself and his family was a blacksmith by the name of James Warfield. James Warfield was born in Maryland circa 1819, and sometime between the fall of 1860 and perhaps the summer of 1862, he purchased the plot of land that we find ourselves on right now. A restored version of his home stands here in the background. Right behind the home is where his blacksmith shop, various sheds and outbuildings would have been located. He advertised this as one of the best blacksmith shops in the country. This is something that he took a huge level of pride in. And indeed, it was conveniently located. It was very well placed. Located right here along the road leading up to the Emmitsburg Road. This is a major corridor of commerce throughout the 1850s and the 1860s. However, come the invasion of the Army of Northern Virginia, that same roadway that once brought wealth and prosperity and travelers will now bring an invading army of 75,000 men. And even today, we can get a sublime view of the U.S. Army battle lines on Cemetery Ridge behind me. If you're looking for a great vista of the Union battle lines, you can't do much better than the Warfield farm. Up to our north, we can see Cemetery Hill, we can see the crown of Culp's Hill, and then extending downward to Little Round Top and Big Round Top. And as we stand here considering all of this, in 1863, the Confederates were doing exactly the same thing. This was a prime artillery platform. As E.P. Alexander's artillery battalion finds out, this will also be a prime staging ground for the Confederate assaults that will push toward those geographic features on the evening of July 2nd.
I've moved around to the front of the Warfield house here so that we can just get another look. Now again, as Jared mentioned, this is a restored version of the house. The Park Service has done an amazing job of getting this back to close to its original look. And one thing that you don't think about when you're talking about war and battles and things like that is how it affects the people. Having been in an area myself and seeing people in a refugee crisis, I can tell you firsthand, there's nothing more sad or heartbreaking. And James Warfield and his family were some of those refugees who were fleeing this area as the battle was drawing near. So again, we've got Barksdale's brigade over here and E. Porter Alexander's artillery battalion back behind the house. So the Warfield family got out of here for their safety because of where the battle was going to be fought. But there was another reason. James Warfield was a black man.
When James Warfield purchased this property as the American Civil War was beginning, he had the extraordinary opportunity to be ordinary, to be an African-American blacksmith who was a property owner in a growing and thriving community. It presented him all sorts of opportunities that were often denied to African American laborers and tradesmen. Hanging over him throughout this entire quest for personal growth and agency, though, is the fact that he lives only 7 miles above the Mason-Dixon line. This posed a degree of peril for he and his 7 children and his wife. In 1862, as the Maryland campaign is underway, there are specters of invasion and rumor that are sweeping throughout the community here in Adams County. And unfortunately for the Warfields and the several hundred African American residents that called Gettysburg home, those worst fears became reality in the form of a nightmare in June and July of 1863. The Army of Northern Virginia, 75,000 strong, seeks to gain a victory on their enemy's home turf, and they are also seizing what they referred to as contraband of war. And this is in essence code for the kidnapping of free African Americans en masse throughout South Central Pennsylvania. And newspaper accounts of the era, as well as memoirs of the time period, are replete with eyewitness accounts of all of this. Among them was a young man by the name of Albertus McCreary. And this is what he had to say as the Confederates were invading his town. McCreary noted a number of colored people lived in the western part of town, and when on the first day a great many of them were gathered together by the Confederates and marched out of town. As they passed our house, our old washerwoman called out, "Goodbye, we are going back into slavery." Most of them were crying and moaning. It was this sort of situation that the Warfield family sought to avert. And in an hour of great desperation, Warfield packed up his children, his personal belongings. One of his children was only 1 year of age. You can imagine as a parent the sort of pressure that placed upon him. And presumably they flee north, perhaps to Harrisburg, which was considered a little bit of a safe haven for these refugees. They are able to avert capture by the Confederates, but what they find when they get back astounds them. And indeed, it was the stuff of nightmares.
So you can only imagine what it must have been like here on the afternoon of July 2nd. You have bullets and artillery that are flying back and forth. Like this would have been right in like the vortex of some of the most violent fighting that took place here at Gettysburg. So maybe you have wounded Confederates who are taking refuge leaning up against the back of the house. We don't know for sure, but it's highly likely that the Warfield home here was used as like a field hospital or a triage station, and it would have been completely wrecked. So again, imagine what it's like for the Warfields. They've been displaced from their home. They have the fear of the unknown, and then they come back to see their home and their livelihood just wrecked. And not only that, but the war is going to remain with them for a certain period of time, because right here, buried in their front yard, are soldiers from the 13th, 16th, and 19th Mississippi. The reason that we know that is because there was something that was created called the Elliott burial map that marked the burial spots of the dead here at Gettysburg. And just over a dozen guys, 13 or 14, would have been buried right here. Now they were later dug up and reinterred at Hollywood Cemetery. But yeah, it must have been a heartbreaking scene for the Warfield family.
Naturally, when the Warfields return here, it looks completely apocalyptic in nature. And like so many Gettysburg residents, Warfield filed a compensation claim. He petitioned the government trying to get some recovery dollars so he could rebuild his life. This was a long and arduous process. He put forth a claim for over $500. He only gets $106, which is dramatically more than what most Gettysburg residents receive. Despite that aid money, he's never quite able to rebuild his blacksmith shop to the vibrancy that it once was. Throughout the late 1860s, he tries to unsuccessfully sell the property. He puts ads in the local newspapers. And it's ultimately a story of despair because he's unable to rebuild the life that he put so much work into. And ultimately, he passes away in the early morning of June 2nd, 1875, within this very household. Although Warfield was only in his 50s when he passed away, and even though he could not rebuild his life, he was able to retain what was most important to he and his family as a result of the battle that took place here, and that was their freedom. And it is quite possibly that his son, James Jr., enlisted in the United States Army and served in the United States Colored Troops and was wounded at the Crater, the Battle of Petersburg, in the summer of 1864. This was a family that witnessed the hard hand of war in a very evocative way, and visiting places like this allow us to compare and contrast and juxtapose all of the fascinating historical characters who traversed this property in 1863. In this farmstead, you have a free African-American blacksmith farmer, and then, just right across the road, is the flank of William Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade. In 1856, as a member of the House of Representatives, Barksdale went out on the floor of Congress and he said, "I deny the right of Congress to legislate slavery anywhere except to protect it." What a major point of comparison for us as historians. And I'd almost like to think of this sort of hypothetical situation where Warfield and Barksdale may have crossed paths. What sort of conversation would they have had with each other? We'll never know the answer to that question, but these are the sorts of big contextual points that make Gettysburg such an interesting place to consider the bigger issues at stake as the American Civil War is being waged.
Right. Jared and I have moved over to the National Cemetery now, and we don't really know exactly where James Warfield is buried. I always like to go to cemeteries and graves when I can, but there is a connection that he has right here in the National Cemetery.
In the first part of our segment, we looked at the burials, the mysterious burials of 13 unknown Confederate soldiers who were buried in the front yard of the James Warfield property on the southern end of the Gettysburg battlefield. There is another burial associated with that property that we can find right here in the Gettysburg National Cemetery. This is the burial ground that President Abraham Lincoln, of course, consecrated with his Gettysburg Address on November 19th, 1863. But as we can see in these newer sections of this cemetery, that just because the Civil War ended doesn't mean that America's struggle for these definitions of freedom doesn't continue. And within here we can see soldiers from the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and beyond. One of the veterans who is buried within these hallowed grounds is a gentleman by the name of Fred Matthews. Fred Matthews was the grandson of James Warfield. He was the son of Martha Warfield, who was living here at the time of the battle. Fred was born 16 years after the American Civil War, and he undoubtedly heard stories from his family members about the coming of the Army of Northern Virginia, how his family had to flee in the name of their personal safety and maintaining their freedom. He ultimately picks up the mantle of military service. He joins the United States Cavalry, and in 1901 and 1902, he serves in Cuba in the wake of the Spanish-American War. Thereafter, he is transferred to Fort Robinson, Nebraska, where he joins Company C of the 10th United States Cavalry, better known as the Buffalo Soldiers. It was wrongly believed by many for a number of years that this cemetery was a segregated cemetery, but that is not the case. There are a number of African American veterans buried here, including some from the Civil War, including a gentleman buried right next to Fred Matthews. Fred dies a relatively young man in 1937. His mother, Martha, however, though, lives until 1956, and she dies just shy of her 101st birthday. And to think of the trajectory of the American story that she witnessed in her lifetime. She's born in 1856 in the era of slavery. She dies in the 1950s as the civil rights movement is ongoing. All of this underscores the fact that there are so many layers of history to be found in Gettysburg, and we shouldn't look at them as isolated or segregated incidents or personalities. They're all interwoven, they're all interconnected, and it doesn't detract from the Civil War story to look at these broader tales of the human experience. They enrich each other, and it behooves us to look back on stories like the Warfields to understand that.
If you like what you saw here, YouTube seems to think that you'll like this next video as well. So be sure to click on the link, and also be sure to subscribe to catch all of the future content when it comes out.